interactions between different living organisms occur all of the time inside ecosystems and food webs, as we've seen in previous lessons. What this session will look at is the different interactions that take place between living organisms. So this is focusing on the biotic factors within an ecosystem, and the benefits and the drawbacks of different scenarios using examples. So the first one we're going to have a look at is competition. This picks up from the last session. What we saw in the idea around competition is where two species compete for the same resource. And we saw that there are two types of competition. The first was intraspecific, and this is where it occurs between individuals of the same species. So two lions going after the same antelope or zebra. And then there's interspecific, which is where individuals of different species, for example, a lion and a cheetah, go after the same resource. Now, competition, generally speaking, is seen as a negative outcome for all involved. So the individuals lose out because they have to share their overall resource, and they therefore have less energy and less biomass to carry forwards, and they're less likely to survive a competition scenario. Even if one perhaps outcompetes the other, it's possible that they're going to be injured, or they may just have less energy and resource to go forwards with. And that's detrimental to that particular organism and its population. So that's competition. The next one we're going to have a look at is antagonism. Antagonism is generally covered as an interaction that is positive for one organism and negative for the other. There are three really common examples of antagonism. Predation being the obvious one. Predation is whereby a consumer, generally a secondary consumer or higher, will feed on a primary consumer or lower. In this case, the cheetah chasing the gazelle. But we must also remember that grazing, which is where primary consumers feed on plant material, and this doesn't just include cows eating grass, this can include any organism that feeds on any kind of plant material. This doesn't include fruits, but we'll talk about fruits a little bit later. And parasitism. Parasitism is where an organism will benefit at the cost of another. Now, the image on the left is a cuckoo egg, and the cuckoos lay their eggs in other birds' nests. This is quite a famous case study, really. The cuckoo hatches, and the chick will push the other eggs out of the nest. And the bird that's been parasitized essentially will be unaware of this, and it will feed that cuckoo until it's older, and it will fly the nest, and to the detriment of the population of the other species. On the right hand side is a tick, and the tick essentially feeds on the blood and the nutrients of other organisms, often to their detriment. So ticks can cause infestations, and they can cause other diseases as well. So it's generally seen as a negative for the other organism and a positive for the tick. So that's antagonism. The next one we'll have a quick look at is something called mutualism. And this is generally, people see this as what we call symbiosis. And this is where two organisms, two species, co-evolve side by side to help each other out. This is an interaction where both species benefit. And the examples given here include the clownfish, which lives within the anemone. And the clownfish acts as a kind of cleaner. So the clownfish gets a home, and the anemone gets a cleaner, essentially. And both benefit from this particular relationship, even though they don't directly interact with each other. The bee and the plants and pollination. The bee gets food, and the plant benefits because the bee carries pollen from plant to plant and causes cross-pollination, and this keeps species strong, and it stops interbreeding, essentially, and it stops the plant having to asexually reproduce. And then the bottom image, what you've got here are some birds that will feed on the back of this particular buffalo, and it'll pick off any kind of parasites. Sometimes this can be seen as a non-beneficial relationship for the buffalo, but in this particular example, if it is feeding on parasites, there is a benefit for both species in this particular example. So that's mutualism. The next one is commensalism. Commensalism is whereby one organism gets no overall benefit, but the other does benefit. And there are three examples here. The pilot fish with the shark. These are fish that generally swim with the shark. The shark doesn't really know that they're there. It doesn't really bother the shark. It's not the shark's natural kind of prey, and the pilotfish will just feed off scraps that the shark doesn't eat when it consumes its food. Now, these particular fish aren't feeding on parasites, so there is no benefit to the shark in this particular example. Bottom left, you've got an egret, essentially an egret that feeds on insects, and it doesn't bother the cow, but the key thing here is that the cow, as it grazes, will interrupt some insects that may decide to fly or jump, and as they do, the egret will be able to eat those insects. So there's no real interaction as such between the cow and the egret, but what's really important is that the egret is benefiting from the cow's grazing. And then on the bottom right, you've got these barnacles that grow on, you get these on whales and some turtle species. The turtle or the whale don't necessarily notice that the barnacle's there, and it certainly doesn't cause them any harm, but the barnacles get they get a home essentially, and they can be moved around and they can be moved into areas, and they feed on kind of plankton as such, and they're able to get their food by being moved around on the front of the whale's face essentially. So that's quite an interesting one, the commensalism one. The next one that we'll have a look at is neutralism, and it's another interesting one, and it's quite hard to find examples of this one. This is where two species interact but do not directly affect each other. It's really hard to find examples of these because generally speaking, as we've seen, most species in an ecosystem will interact in some way, shape or form. So even if they don't necessarily eat each other, a predator could have an impact on, say, a plant species by over-predating on a prey species, and there being too many of them or too few of them, and that impacts on the plant species. This is a really tenuous example of dandelion and a salmon in a riverside ecosystem. To be honest, they're not linked at all. They're in the same ecosystem, so they would maybe sit within the same food web, but they're so disconnected that they don't affect each other in this particular case. And if you can find examples of neutralism, then you're kind of good going, because it's generally hard to prove that those two species don't have an interaction on each other, even if it's indirectly. So that's neutralism. And then the last one is amensalism, and this is where one organism is inhibited or destroyed and the other remains completely unaffected. The examples here are the tree is a black walnut tree, and this famously releases a chemical into the soil that prevents any other plants growing in that root system, and it doesn't affect the black walnut, but it stops other things living there by killing them. And then the bottom right is an algal bloom, and the algal bloom, again, the algal bloom just happens. It doesn't benefit the algae that it's blooming and it's replicating at a high number, but it does affect fish and other species that live within that body of water who are kind of detrimented in that particular case. So what is really important to consider when you're looking at interactions in this particular case is look at the scenario involved and try to place it somewhere on this Venn diagram. So at the bottom you have negatives, on the left you have positives, and on the right you have neutrals. All you need to try to do is place your case study, your example, into one of these categories. When you feel you're confident with this, have a go at the quiz, and it will give you some case studies, and it'll ask you to place them into one of these particular circles. So have a go at that when you're ready.